Hi guys, hope everyone's well and welcome back to the Improvement Podcast. So in this episode I'm going to touch on tempo. So in terms of tempo is basically the control you have during the exercise. The speed of each part of the rep is your exercise tempo. And in terms of why tempo is important, it will affect the effectiveness of an exercise. As well as that, it will arguably affect how safe the exercise is to perform in the gym. And what I mean by that is, if let's say you pick any exercise, let's say leg press is a good example. If from the top you have no control on the way down, and you don't even try and control it at the bottom, you let it bounce your knees off your chest at the bottom, and then you start driving up afterwards, how do you think that's going to feel on your knees? Probably not the best. And once you get stronger and stronger over time, your knees are probably going to give out before your quads do, and you're probably not going to have a good time in terms of dealing with knee pain for sure. So it's basically important for the effectiveness of the exercise and also the safety. And in terms of how it affects the effectiveness, going through, let's say, a controlled tempo, is if you think about like a controlled concentric. So a concentric is basically when we are going up, so when a muscle shortens. So if you think about going up on a squat, or let's say pulling down on a lat pull down, or driving your heels up or backing up, or it depends if you're doing a lying hamstring curl, or basically when our legs bending during a hamstring curl. That is basically the concentric phase. Another example is when you're driving up on a bench press. So on, let's say, a hamstring curl or a lat pull down, they're two great examples. If you're trying to target your lats, if anyone's ever tried to keep the weight on their lats, or they're trying to just isolate their lats, if let's say you just throw the weight or use a ton of momentum, it's really hard to keep the weight on your lat at all times and ensure your lat is doing the work. So if let's say you're doing a lat pull down and you explode from the top, or you explode up on a hamstring curl, are you actually taking the movement through a large range of motion with your hamstring or with your lats, or is momentum doing it? What I mean by that is, like, maybe the first half of the rep, first 3 quarters, you're using your lat or your hamstring, but after that it's probably acceleration just continuing the movement and making you get to the end of the rep. For example, like, if a good example of why is, let's take pushing a car for example. When we are starting to push a car, if you've ever had to jump start a car or help push a car for whatever reason, if you've ever had to do so, it's really hard to get moving. It's quite difficult to get moving, but once you've got momentum, once you have started getting it moving, then it's easier to keep it moving. The same applies for exercises. When you're changing direction, it's really hard to change direction and start the movement, but if let's say you're already accelerating really fast and then you want to go and let's say finish it, like if you're pushing a car, let's say you're pushing a car down the street and you go really fast half the way down the street and then you just stop pushing the car and then the car keeps going, that's like your muscle. Or that's like when you're doing exercise, you might be only pushing the car halfway the way through, but it will keep travelling. And the same as when you're doing an exercise. So if you, let's say, are doing a hamstring curl and you explode up and go as hard as you can out the bottom position, then your hamstring might not actually be getting it to the top. It might just be momentum, and your hamstring might be doing very little of the work. So that is basically the times when you want to have a controlled concentric, or a controlled drive up on the movement, if that makes sense. During, let's say, when you are like a concentric, like I said, when you're going up in a hamstring curl or pulling down in a lat pull down, when a muscle shortens, or like going up on a squat or a bench press. And certain scenarios you want to basically control it more than others. For example, when you're doing a bench press, I wouldn't say you need to stress as much about making sure you're controlling the concentric and making it intentionally slow. I'd just say drive up as fast as you can. Same applies with a squat, but on examples like a hamstring curl, just when we're trying to isolate a muscle and keep the load on our target muscle, it's going to be beneficial to have a controlled concentric. We basically want to only go as fast as we can while keeping the load on the target muscle. Because if we're exploding, let's say, exploding up on any movement, let's say you're doing a row or pull down, it's really hard to keep the weight on, let's say, a one small muscle group that you're trying to focus on. For example, see if I told you to do, let's say a row. A row's a good example, but only use your lats, which is a muscle that basically runs under your armpit, or that flares out under your armpit. If I say try and keep that on at all times and only use that while moving as fast as you possibly can, it's really hard to do both at the same time. So a good example is think about throwing or sprinting. You don't think during the movement, you don't think while you're sprinting much, you don't think while you're throwing much, you think before and after. It's hard to focus on, let's say, technique while also doing it as dynamically as you can. Like if you ask a sprinter when do they focus on technique, it's probably not when they're moving as fast as you can. It's probably when they are like doing practices, when they're drilling technique. So in that case, it is potentially good to have a controlled concentric sometimes on isolation exercises where you're trying to keep the weight on a target muscle, or if you struggle to connect to a target muscle, only move as fast as you can while keeping the load on the desired muscle. And when we are, let's say, doing an eccentric, so a lowering phase, if we're not controlling it, half the rep could potentially be just gone. And what I mean by that is, when we are doing a rep, half the rep is the way up, half the rep is the way down. So we're missing out on half the rep. We're kind of undertraining our muscle for half the movement if we're not controlling the way down. And we know we're also stronger on the eccentric. So what that will basically mean is we're not going to, let's say, have poorer performance massively from having a pure eccentric. We're not going to have much poorer performance from controlling the eccentric. We're probably going to still perform relatively well. Yes, we might not be strong or get as much reps, but the muscle growth happens when we are doing the eccentric portion of the movement. It's shown to be a really important part of the rep to basically build muscle. And in terms of if we're not doing that, that's half the rep we're basically skimping out on, we're missing out on, which is not ideal. And in terms of how it affects the safety of a movement, if we're controlling lowering phases, it plays a big part in keeping joints healthy and our injury risk basically lower. And the reason being is the idea of inertia. So inertia is basically the idea that a movement will continue its current motion until a force or something causes its speed or direction to change. And what I mean by that is, let's take the car example again. So if, let's say, we start pushing a car, it's hard to get going, but once we've got it going, we're pushing it as fast as we can. And from there, once we're pushing it as fast as we can, see, to stop it, you're going to have to, it's going to either gradually stop over time, or we're going to have to slow it down and stop it. And see if, let's say, you push the car as fast as you can, and then someone's at the other side of the car to stop it. It's just the one person, and they're just standing there trying to brace and prepare for the impact of that car. It's probably going to absolutely batter them. They're probably going to get hit by it, get injured. They're going to be on the deck, probably crying. And what I'm basically trying to say is, unless we intentionally slow movements down, unless, let's say, you gradually slow movement down, you will basically, something's going to have to change that direction, and it's going to be your muscle and your joint at the end of the range of motion, unless it's controlled throughout. So if, let's say, we accelerate, something's going to have to slow it. And if we're not doing a really slow controlled movement, then there's going to be a lot of stress on our tendons, ligaments, and our joints at the bottom of the movement. Just like there's probably going to be a lot of stress on you if you don't gradually control the car to a halt, and instead you just stand in front of it and let it smack you to stop it. So I hope that analogy makes sense. But basically, we want to control it so that we're not having all that load bang on our joints. And also, if, let's say, we're doing a movement, let's say we're doing a squat. If we're squatting 100 kilograms, we might actually be experiencing more load than 100 kilograms during the movement. And the reason being is, again, acceleration or inertia. So what I mean by that is, when we are lowering down on a squat, if we've got 100 kilograms, if we just drop it as fast as we can and then just stop instantly, then we will basically have more than 100 kilograms experienced on our joints, on our body, on our muscles, because of acceleration. We need to slow that down because the weight's acting against gravity. And so yeah, acceleration basically increases load placed on a muscle and joint. So we want to think about having control. A good example of like acceleration making a difference is if we jump on a scale and then land on it, you're not going to weigh what you currently weigh. You're going to weigh what you currently weigh plus additional weight from the acceleration of landing on the scale. And that's a good example. And that acceleration is basically going to be experienced on our joints during the movement. And pausing can also help with this, because when we pause, it will basically mean we're not having as suddenly or not having as sudden a change of direction during movements. And yeah, controlling and pausing movements will basically mean less load exposure while still training to failure, and less stress on the target tissue, and also less repetitive stress as well. And so if you think about it, if we are like pausing a movement and controlling it, but we're still reaching failure, then we know to build muscle, what matters most is progressing over time and training close to failure. So if, let's say, we're still reaching failure and we can still progress our movements and get stronger at them over time with a controlled loading phase, with a pause, it means there's going to be less stress on our target or less stress on our joints while still getting results, which is why we want to control the loading phase of movements. And as well as that, so we can just keep the load on our muscles, like I said. In terms of when to pause movements, so when you're pausing movements, it's typically good to just control the changes of direction of movements, just to ensure your muscles controlling it there. Like I said, see if you're doing a hamstring curl and you are, let's say you're throwing it up and you're spending no time at the top, you're not controlling the lowering phase, then your hamstrings barely doing any work at the top, because you're probably just using your hamstring at the bottom of it to do most of the work, and then it's just bouncing out the top, and then you're controlling the bottom of the loading phase. So to ensure your muscles actually doing the work, it can be a good idea to pause at each end of the rep. And it just means our movements will always be pretty controlled if we are pausing movements. And yeah, so it just ensures your muscles doing the work. And it can help keep it on the target muscle as well. For example, if let's say we are doing a row, like or let's say we're trying to target our lats during a pull down or row again. If we aren't, let's say, pausing it can be really hard to keep the weight on the muscle, especially if you don't connect with a muscle easily. So just any other movement, typically if you pause it, it's going to mean it's easier to just keep the load on the muscle. Try it yourself. Try doing a movement, let's say a bicep curl, not controlling it at all, not spending a second at each end of the rep, and it's going to be much harder to stop other muscle groups from being involved in the movement. Another example of when we might want to pause is when we're experiencing pain. And the reason being is pausing can help with load reduction and also minimize like inertia or stress on our joints when we are changing direction. And a good example of this is, let's say, when we are doing a squat. If we are pausing at the bottom of a squat, it means one, our muscle will definitely be doing the work driving us out the hole, and not other tissues, which means our tendons and ligaments won't be driving us out the bottom of a squat. As well as that, if we pause at the bottom of the squat, it's going to mean there's less stress on our joints from changing direction, so our muscles going to be working probably more effectively, as well as we are probably going to have less joint issues. And another time where you might want to pause movements is if there's a benefit of that movement and that part of the range of motion. For example, a leg extension. A leg extension is the only movement we can load our leg when it's straight, where we can load our quad when our leg is straight. And if you think about any other time in the gym, you can't really do that on any other movement. Squats, leg presses, lunges, they all load your quad where your leg's fully bent, not when your leg's fully straight. So to get the most out of that movement, it makes sense spending a bit of time in that position where your leg's fully straight to get the most benefit from that exercise and to get the most value from it. The same can apply on other movements. For example, if you are doing let's say a leg curl. A leg curl's the only time where you can pause when your leg's fully bent, really. During, let's say, a straight leg deadlift, we don't do that. We don't have the ability to pause and squeeze our hamstring and spend time there, so it makes sense doing so when we're doing a hamstring curl, just to ensure we're getting the most out of that exercise when we're utilising it for the benefit it has. And we could maybe do the same on, let's say, a tricep extension if there's still tension on it at the bottom, which usually is if we're using a cable. Then it makes sense to contract and squeeze your tricep and spend time there, so that we are basically getting the most out of that movement. The same applies if, let's say, we're doing a close grip bench press to target our triceps, or a dip to target our triceps. Where's that loading our tricep the most? It's loading our tricep the most when our arm's fully bent at the bottom, when our triceps in the stretch position. So it makes sense, if the benefit of that exercise is spending time in the stretch, or is loading our tricep in the stretch position, does it not make sense to spend time there to maximise it? In my opinion, it does. Especially when you've not, let's say, got a lot of sets in your session or in your week for a certain body part. You really want to make sure you're making the most of them, and make sure the right muscle's doing the work, which can be done by pausing movements. And basically thinking, is there a benefit of being in a certain position? If so, it makes sense to spend time there. And it can basically increase the perceived quality of the set as well. And as I touched on in the previous episode, on when I was touching on like a stimulus versus fatigue, basically how much stress you get on your target muscle for how much fatigue you get on your central nervous system. If we're pausing movements, we're probably going to increase how much stimulus we can get and less fatigue, because we will be able to keep the load on the right muscle. We'll be able to most likely reduce load from having better control, which it is fun using more weight, but it's also more fun making progress. So that should be the priority at the end of the day if you want to maximise things. So adding a pause can help you do so. So yeah, that's basically why tempo is important. Quick recap: it affects the effectiveness of a movement and the safety of a movement. In terms of what tempo I recommend using, a controlled eccentric. So the loading phase should be mostly around 2 to 3 seconds most of the time, and then explosive concentric. But there's some examples where you want to not be too explosive on the way up, just to keep the load on the target muscle. During things when, let's say, other muscles could potentially take over, you might want to be intentionally slow, so that we can use that muscle that we're trying to use through the full range. And it's also good to pause movements when we see value in being in a certain position. For example, if you're doing a leg extension, makes sense spending time at the top, because it's the only time you can do so. Or let's say you've got a leg press at your gym where you can get a ton of bend at the knee, and you can get a ridiculous amount of knee flexion, and we can be in a really, really deep stretch for our quad. It feels great on our quads, it feels super effective. It makes sense being nice and controlled in that position, maybe even pausing there. So hope you enjoyed the episode. Thank you very much for listening. If you did, feel free to like, share, subscribe, leave it on your story, and drop me a rating and review. The support of the podcast is greatly appreciated as always. And if you have any, like I said, topics you want to see, please feel free to just let me know.